A new beginning. Amy had always considered herself resilient, the type of woman who could weather life's storms with grace. At 45, she had rebuilt her life after a series of setbacks, finding solace in her passion for crafting handmade accessories. What had started as a hobby blossomed into a career, one that gave her joy and allowed her to connect with people from all walks of life. Her life wasn't always this peaceful. Amy's marriage to Henry had once been filled with love and hope. They met at a corporate event years ago, and their chemistry had been immediate. For years into their marriage, they welcomed a son, and life seemed to be on a perfect trajectory. But as time passed, things changed. Henry became distant, his once loving nature replaced by cold indifference. He grew resentful of Amy's success and began treating her as if she were an inconvenience, not a partner. The home they shared, which Amy had painstakingly designed and paid for with her hard-earned savings, became a battleground. Henry's complaints grew louder and more frequent, his frustrations seeping into every corner of their lives. He began to spend days idly at home, quitting his job without explanation, while Amy shouldered the financial burden of their mortgage and their lives. Henry's parents, who had always disapproved of Amy, started visiting more frequently, their criticism sharp and constant. It was during one of these visits that Henry, without warning, invited his parents to move into their home permanently. Amy was stunned, her objections brushed aside as if they meant nothing. The house, once her sanctuary, now felt like a prison. The breaking point: the days after Henry's parents moved in were filled with tension. His mother, Catherine, and father, Willie, treated Amy like a guest in her own home. Every decision she made was questioned, every effort she put into maintaining their space was criticized. Henry, who once stood by her side, now supported his parents' every whim, leaving Amy feeling more isolated than ever. Their once harmonious home had become a place of constant conflict. Henry's attitude had shifted from cold indifference to outright hostility. He started making messes on purpose, leaving beer cans and dirty dishes scattered around the house, expecting Amy to clean up after him like a servant. She knew this was his way of lashing out, but it still hurt deeply. One evening, after a particularly heated argument, Amy reached her breaking point. Henry had demanded that she cook dinner for his parents, and when she refused, he exploded. His insults, once subtle, had now become venomous, with his parents watching and nodding in approval. Amy stared at him, her heart racing with a mixture of fear and anger. She had enough. Without a word, she walked to the bedroom, packed a suitcase she had prepared weeks before, and left the house without looking back. She knew the life she had built with Henry was over, but she was prepared for what came next. The escape plan: as Amy walked out that night, she knew there was no going back. The love that once defined her marriage had been replaced with resentment and anger. As she drove away, the weight of the situation settled in. She was leaving behind the life she had built, but also freeing herself from years of emotional strain. For weeks before her departure, Amy had been quietly preparing. She had already transferred ownership of the house to Henry and his parents, knowing full well they would struggle to maintain it. The mortgage payments, which she had been solely responsible for, were far beyond what Henry or his parents could handle, especially considering Henry's recent gambling debts. He had always hidden his addiction well, but Amy wasn't blind. She had seen the betting slips piling up, the signs of financial ruin he was steadily marching toward. The day after she left, Amy made one last visit to the house, not to reclaim anything, but to ensure everything was in place. She had left a surveillance system active, hidden in plain sight, which captured hours of footage of Henry and his parents discussing their plans to take over the house entirely. Armed with this footage, Amy had the upper hand. She could expose their deceit whenever she wished, but instead, she chose to move on quietly. She wasn't interested in revenge, only in freedom. Henry, oblivious to Amy's preparations, continued his life as if nothing had changed. But when the first mortgage payment landed solely in his lap, reality hit him like a tidal wave. He hadn't anticipated the financial burden, and soon after, he and his parents began to feel the strain. The luxurious lifestyle they envisioned for themselves quickly turned into a nightmare of overdue bills, collection notices, and mounting debt. Henry's parents, once so eager to move in, began visiting less frequently, no longer able to afford the trips. As the weeks turned into months, Amy settled into her new life. She found a modest yet beautiful apartment and refocused her energy on her business. Her handmade accessories had become more than just a hobby, they were her livelihood, and the blog she had started to document her creations was gaining popularity. Requests for custom designs began pouring in, and Amy's business flourished in ways she hadn't anticipated. Then, one afternoon, Amy received an unexpected knock on her door. To her surprise, Henry stood there, looking disheveled and desperate. His parents were nowhere in sight, and his once confident demeanor had crumbled. "We can't make the payments," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "We're going to lose the house." Amy stood silently for a moment, letting his words sink in. This was the moment she had predicted, the moment she knew would come. Henry was drowning in the consequences of his own actions, and now he was coming to her for help. Facing the consequences, Amy took a deep breath, her mind racing. The last thing she had expected was for Henry to show up at her door, pleading for help. But as she looked at him, standing there defeated, she couldn't bring herself to feel the sympathy he seemed to expect. She had given everything to their marriage, her time, her energy, her love, and Henry had thrown it all away. "Henry, you made your choice," Amy said, her voice steady but firm. "You chose to side with your parents, to push me away. You sold the house, invited them in, and now you're facing the consequences." Henry's shoulders slumped, the weight of his mistakes evident on his face. "I didn't think it would end like this," he muttered, barely able to meet her eyes. "I thought we could manage, but, the debts, the mortgage, it's too much." Amy crossed her arms, feeling the power shift between them. For years, she had been the one struggling under the burden of their finances, while Henry squandered money on gambling and allowed his parents to disrespect her. Now, the tables had turned. "And what do you expect me to do, Henry? Pay off your debts? Cover your mistakes?" she asked, her voice tinged with incredulity. "You put yourself in this situation. I'm not going to bail you out." Henry's eyes flickered with a brief flash of anger, but it quickly faded into resignation. I don't know what else to do," he said, his voice cracking. "We're going to lose everything." Amy sighed, feeling a mix of frustration and pity. She had already moved on from the life they once shared, and she wasn't about to be dragged back into Henry's chaos. "You need to figure it out," she said, stepping aside to signal the end of the conversation. "I'm not responsible for you anymore." Henry lingered for a moment, as if hoping Amy would change her mind. But when it became clear that no help was coming, he nodded, his expression hollow. "I guess this is it, then," he muttered before turning to leave. As the door closed behind him, Amy felt an overwhelming sense of relief. She had finally broken free from the toxic cycle that had dominated her life for so long. But even as she watched Henry walk away, she couldn't help but feel a small pang of sadness. The man she had once loved was now a stranger to her, his life unraveling before her eyes. For the next few weeks, Amy focused on herself. She threw herself into her work, expanding her blog and launching a series of online workshops that drew even more attention to her business. She found fulfillment in the connections she made with her clients, and the joy of creating something with her own hands gave her a renewed sense of purpose. But Henry's situation continued to deteriorate. Word got back to Amy that he and his parents had been forced to move into a small, rundown apartment on the outskirts of town. Henry had taken on a part-time job to try to make ends meet, but it wasn't enough to cover the mounting debts from his gambling and the mortgage he could no longer afford. Amy's decision to transfer the house's mortgage into Henry's name had been the final blow. Without her financial support, the payments were impossible to keep up with. And although she had no intention of returning to that life, she couldn't ignore the small part of her that wondered if Henry would ever truly learn from his mistakes. A new future months passed, and Amy's life blossomed in ways she hadn't anticipated. Her blog had taken off, drawing a steady stream of readers interested in her unique designs and her journey to independence. She had been invited to collaborate with other creators and even received offers to feature her work in online magazines. The life she had envisioned during her marriage, one where she could freely pursue her passion, was finally becoming a reality. One evening, while Amy was preparing for a live workshop, her phone buzzed with an unfamiliar number. Hesitant, she answered, and to her surprise, it was Henry's mother, Catherine. "I know you don't want to hear from me, but..." "Henry is in a bad place," Catherine said, her voice heavy with regret. "He's lost everything. I just thought you should know." Amy listened silently, unsure of how to respond. She had left Henry behind for a reason, but the knowledge that he was struggling, truly broken this time, stirred something within her. She had no desire to return to the life they once shared, but it was clear that Henry was no longer the same man who had driven her away. After the call, Amy sat for a long time, thinking about everything that had happened. She had moved on, her life was better now, filled with creativity, freedom, and a sense of peace. But as she thought about Henry, lost and spiraling, she couldn't help but feel a sense of closure was still missing. The next day, Amy decided to visit Henry. Not out of obligation, but to see for herself what had become of the man she had once loved. When she arrived at his apartment, it was worse than she had imagined. The small, cramped space was cluttered, and Henry looked like a shadow of his former self. His once sharp eyes were dull, and the confidence that had once defined him was gone. He barely reacted when he saw her at the door, only offering a weak nod in greeting. They sat in silence for a few minutes before Amy finally spoke. "What happened to you, Henry?" He sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I don't know. I thought I had everything figured out, but I lost control. The gambling, the debts, losing the house. I don't know how to fix it." Amy could see the pain in his eyes, the regret that hung heavily on his shoulders. But there was no satisfaction in seeing him like this. She had already moved on, and she wasn't here to rescue him. "I can't fix this for you, Henry," she said softly. "But maybe it's time you start fixing it for yourself." Henry looked at her, his expression a mix of sadness and understanding. "I know," he whispered. "I've made too many mistakes." Amy stood, ready to leave. Her mission was complete. She had come to confirm her decision to leave, and she had. Now, it was time to close this chapter of her life for good. As Amy stepped out of Henry's apartment, a weight lifted from her shoulders. For the first time in years, she felt truly light. Confronting her past had set her free. She could now move forward, unburdened by the past. The future stretched before her, brimming with possibilities, and she was eager to embrace every moment.